One of the ideas is that, through the Cold War, that mechanism, the U.S. had major interest to weaken the Soviet Union, and therefore the collapse could be attributed to pressure and manipulation from the United States. Is there truth to that?
The pressure from the United States, this is part of the Cold War. And Cold War, part of that story, but it doesn't explain the Soviet collapse. And the reason is quite simple. The United States of America didn't want the Soviet Union to collapse and disintegrate. They didn't want that at the start of the Cold War in 1948. We now have the strategic documents. They were concerned about that. They didn't want to do that. And certainly they didn't want to do that in the year 1990-91. As late as August of 1991, the day of the month of the coup in Moscow, President Bush, George H.W. Bush, travels from Moscow to Kiev and gives famous or infamous speech called Chicken Kiev speech, basically warning Ukrainians against going for independence. The Soviet collapse was a huge headache for the administration in the White House for a number of reasons. They liked to work with Gorbachev. The Soviet Union was emerging as a junior partner of the United States in the international arena. Collapse was destroying all of that. And on the top of that, there was a question of the nuclear weapons, unaccounted nuclear weapons. So the United States was doing everything humanly possible to keep the Soviet Union together in one piece until really late November of 1991, when it became clear that it was a lost cause, and they had to say goodbye to Gorbachev and to the project that he introduced. A few months later, or a year later, there was a presidential campaign, and Bush was running for the second term and was looking for achievements. And there were many achievements. I basically treat him with great respect. But destruction of the Soviet Union was not one of those achievements. He was on the other side of that divide. But the politics, the political campaign, of course, have their own rules, and they produce and give birth to mythology, with which we still, at least in this country, we live till today.
So Gorbachev is an interesting figure in all of this. Is there a possible history where the Soviet Union did not collapse, and some of the ideas that Gorbachev had for the future of the Soviet Union came to life?
Of course, history, on the one hand, there is a statement, it doesn't allow for what ifs. On the other hand, in my opinion, history is full of what if. That's what history is about, and certainly there are scenarios how the Soviet Union would continue. Would continue beyond, let's say, Gorbachev's tenure.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument has been made that the reforms that he introduced, that they were mismanaged and they could be managed differently, or there could be no reforms and there could be continuing stagnation. So that is all possible. What I think would happen one way or another is the Soviet collapse in a different form on somebody else's watch at some later period in time, because we're dealing with not just processes that were happening in the Soviet Union, we're dealing with global processes, and the 20th century turned out to be the century of the disintegration of the empires. Mm-hmm. You look at the globe, at the map of the world in 1914, and you compare it to the map at the end of the 20th century in 1991, 1992, and suddenly you realize that there are many candidates for being the most important event, the most important process in the 20th century. But the biggest global thing that happened was redrawing the map of the world and producing dozens, if not hundreds, of new states. That's the outcome of the different processes of the 20th century. Look, Yugoslavia is falling apart around the same time. Czechoslovakia goes through what can be called a civilized divorce, a very, very rare occurrence in the fall of multinational states. So, yeah, the writing was on the wall, whether it would happen under Gorbachev or later, whether it would happen as the result of reforms or as the result of no reforms. But I think that sooner or later that would happen.
Yeah, it's very possible hundreds of years from now, the way the 20th century is written about as the century defined by the collapse of empires. You call the Soviet Union the last empire. The book is called The Last Empire. So, is there something fundamental about the way the world is that means it's not conducive to the formation of empires?
The meaning that I was putting in the term the Soviet Union as the last empire was that was the Soviet collapse, was the collapse of the last major European empires, traditional empires. That was in the 18th century, 19th century, and through most of the 20th century. The Austria-Hungary died in the midst of World War I. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated. The Brits were gone and left India. And there was the successor to the Russian Empire, called the Soviet Union, was still hanging on there. And then came 1991, and what we see, even with today's Russia, it's a very different sort of policies. Russia or Russian leadership tried to learn a lesson from 1991. So there is no national republics in the Russian Federation that would have more rights than the Russian administrative units. So the structure is different. The nationality policies are different. The level of Russification is much higher. So it is in many ways already a post-imperial formation.